Testing 1, 2, testing. We are ready. We're glad you're here. Happy holiday early. And I'm sure some are traveling already. Welcome to those who are here and welcome to the Facebook folk. We went on a walk today. We decided to walk in a different place, and we walked by Maurice and Linda's place, and we called and said, "Are you home? Could we come in for a short time?" And they said, "Absolutely." And we went in and visited for about 20 minutes. We kept a distance. We were safe. Everything was great. Then it was time to leave, and we had to give each other a hug, and we had to pray. So we blew it there at the end. But obviously we had all the safety that we could put together, and they're doing well and wish they were here and probably watching. But we had a good visit. They're in good spirits, as we have been told and we knew from phone conversations. But they're doing well, and I think see an end to some of what they've gone through soon. So that's a good thing. We're ready for the next woe from Matthew 23. Beginning with verse 16. Matthew 23, verse 16. As we've done all along, we've spent only a moment contrasting it with one of the Beatitudes. And it's contrasted, the next one in our list is Matthew 5, verse 6. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled," or satisfied, depending on your translation. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and they shall be filled or satisfied. It's hungering for righteousness or holiness. And this one contrasted is a greedy for gain. Greedy for gain. Let's read it and let Jesus speak to us. "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, 'Whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated.' You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering upon it, he is obligated. You blind men, what is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by both the altar and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And he who swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." Let me read you a statement about the Beatitude. The Beatitude speaks of strong desire, of driving passion, a force deep inside of the soul. It has to do with ambition of the right sort, which object is to honor, obey, and glorify God by participating in His righteousness. This holy ambition is in great contrast to the common ambitions of men to satisfy their own lust, accomplish their own goals, and satisfy their own egos. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness. I read a story, Martin Lloyd-Jones wrote it, a source that I've used for 40 years. Talked about a young man who was walking with an older man by a lake, and they were talking about righteousness and achieving righteousness. And Martin Lloyd-Jones tells the story of the older man really felt like the young man wanted to learn that lesson, and he knew a good way to teach it. So he had him walk into the pond, and they got to where the water was high enough to where he could immerse him. It wasn't an act of baptism, but it was an immersion so as to make a point. And so because the young man trusted the older man, he did exactly what he was asked to do. They walked into the water. They got up to knee deep, maybe a little above it, and he told them, now I'm going to dunk you in the water and just relax. And he did. And he dunked them in the water, and he held him there a second or two or three or four, and the young man started moving just a little bit, and he held him just another second or two, not more than 5 or 6. Most of us can hold our breath if we take a good breath for a minute or so, some much longer. So after 7 or 8 seconds, he brought him up, but he had grown a little nervous, and when he came out of the water, he just took a real hard breath because he was anxious, not sure what was happening. And the older man said to him, that's what it should be like when you're hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Just like you reached, gasp for that air. It's an effort. It's work. It's a need. Now that young man learned that lesson. I told that story a long time ago when we were in Florida. And out of the blue, a couple of months later, my older 2 children had been talking in the back room in Plantation, Florida. And they came up and said, Dad, have you ever baptized someone and held them under? I says, no, but it would be a good idea. And they says, please don't. Now, Martin Lloyd-Jones wasn't telling a story about an older man who was baptizing someone, but it is an immersion. And wouldn't it be wonderful, though, as we come out of that burial of water, newness of life, if our attitude spiritually is to hunger and thirst for righteousness? And the Beatitude tells us we will be filled. We will be satisfied, the New American Standard says. And right standing before God is the best way I have found to define righteousness. I want to be right with God, hungering for it, thirsting for it. Another story, a good story, was be a time when you've been hungry, really hungry, or you've been really thirsty. Those don't happen much for most of us. We know when the next meal is. We're prepared. If we've messed up somehow and we're out on the road, usually there's a place to stop to get the food, get the thirst quenched. But if we've ever been in a time to hunger and thirst, then we can also learn that lesson. We can apply it rather than someone being held 8 seconds underwater to where they're a little nervous and gasping a little bit when they come up out of the water. Well, what were the Pharisees hungering for? What was their desire in this long woe that was cast alongside their life? First of all, they were called blind guides, not hypocrites. You're blind guides twice, and called a fool. So they were called fools. Psalms tells us that person who does not believe in God, and blind guides. What comes to your mind? Yeah, they're false teachers, and they're leading people astray. What idiom do we think about? Blind lead the blind? It's a reality that a blind person is really not one that you should have confidence in to guide you. Blind leading the blind is not really what you would choose. But these were called religious leaders. You're fools, but you're also blind guides. And what would that connote? They're leading people. They're blind to themselves. They're blind to themselves, and others are watching and following them. So your blindness is leading others into the ditch, if you follow the idiom to the next conclusion. A blind guide is what they were called. And what were they doing? How would you describe verses 16 to 22? Put it in simple language. They'd come up with a plan to tell lies, to be untruthful, to swear, to make an oath. But what you make the oath on is there's a variable mixed in that gave them an out to break the oath. And Jesus calls them on it. And it's hard to understand, except that he repeats two things and gives us the lesson, if you will. But here's an altar in a temple. And the other thing he says, you swear by the temple or you swear by the altar. And the idea is you're not swearing by the temple, but you're swearing by the gold of the temple. You're not swearing by the altar, and that means nothing, but you're swearing by the sacrifice that's placed on the altar. So he spells it out for them, and apparently these were words that they had used, and he confronts them with their words and offers their calculation. Swear by the temple or by the altar, it means nothing. So what are you doing? You're telling a lie. I'm swearing. Hear me swear, see me swear, let me feel good about it. Aren't I good? I'm swearing to something. But it's nothing, and you know it's nothing. It's nothing if you will, in their thinking. They did it to get away with something. The swear, the oath, meant nothing because of what they did it on. But if they swore on the gold in the temple or the sacrifice on the altar, then it meant something. That's when you can trust us to keep our oath. But what if people didn't know the difference? What if they sweared 99% of the time by the altar and by the temple, and no one knew their game that they were playing with words? No one knew that game. And so what were they getting away with? A pretense. They were getting away with something externally. There was no internal stimulus there on their part. They knew they were just telling a lie. And the bottom line is their words meant nothing. Their words had no meaning. Now, other verses in the Scriptures, the New Testament, Titus, I think it is. I actually forgot to go and look at it, but there's an inference there that says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. You've heard that before. And what is that saying? Yeah. Say what you mean. Tell the truth. Roddy says, tell the truth. My yes means yes. I'm not tricking you. I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not trying to whatever. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And that's a similar principle that could be laid beneath these words. Swearing by the temple or the altar compared to the gold or the sacrifice that's in or on that. And he turns it upside down. Why would the sacrifice be more important than the altar? The altar is representative of the place of God. What you put on it is what you're offering, the word. The sacrifice is something you are offering to God. But it's as if it's his altar. And the gold, there's value in gold, don't we know it? But it's the temple. That's the place of God, if you will. That's where God is there for that worship. In the most holy place especially. So they turned it upside down, coming up with this word game, but it allowed them to present a pretense to where their words had no meaning. What they said and what their intent was exactly the opposite. And the encouragement from a wide perspective is tell the truth. When you say something, people ought to know what you mean. Let your words have meaning. Tell the truth. Now, we sometimes will use this in other verses, and we'll talk about it, about whether or not we should swear or make an oath. And I've heard discussions when I was younger that you can never go into a courtroom as a Christian and put your hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as if that were condemned by Scripture. It's really not, but they have made the allowance in most courts in recent decades, really. I affirm. So there was enough of a concern about it by enough people that now I swear or affirm that I will tell the truth. And what is that saying? I better tell the truth or I'm going to be charged with perjury. My words mean something when you affirm or swear to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth. It means something, and you're held accountable for what you say in that courtroom. So it certainly has meaning for us. Some of the references and direction that people would take us to Lucifer and his desire to have God's place and his wanting the worship that God would receive in Isaiah 14. It's stretching it a little, but it certainly shows what someone would want if their desire is to take something from God. Their words don't have the meaning that you would suppose. I want to take us, because I don't want us to run out of time, to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. It's the best way I know to teach the principle that we're being warned against by the woe to the Pharisee of swearing or making an oath and not really meaning what you're saying. You're playing a word game. Oh, I just thought of another thing. Any of you ever do this growing up? I promise, cross my heart and hope to die. And what did you do? Did you ever do that? Well, if you say no, you better have your fingers crossed. We did. And what did we suppose that made possible? If we had our fingers crossed behind our back, whatever we said, it didn't count, and it didn't matter that it didn't count. It gave us an excuse to tell a lie. I have my fingers crossed. So it's pretense. We've done that as a child, hopefully not as an adult. We may not have gone to the trouble to cross our fingers, but maybe we've been guilty of making strong, strong promises with no intent to back them up. I'm hoping on January the 10th to introduce 2 new studies that we're beginning in the new year. The plan for the 3rd, but that's been changed. It will be the next week to start the year. An introduction to a study in sermon form, the God's person in an upside-down world. We're going to study the 8 Beatitudes with some depth, and that's why I'm not spending much time on the Beatitudes now. God's person in an upside-down world. I think we'll benefit from it. And on Wednesday night, I'm hoping for the time that we have to finish the quarter, I want us to study the book of Ecclesiastes. So the introduction in January the 10th will introduce the coming sermons as well as a coming class. This is a marvelous book. And if you've never studied it, you'll enjoy it. If you haven't, chances are I'll say things you haven't heard before. But we'll see. Ecclesiastes 5, we may have to look at this in class form again, briefly at least. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, who do not know that they do wrong. So when you go to worship, when you go to a place of worship, realize where it is, whose it is, and guard your steps. Be aware, acknowledge, be mindful of where you're going. And when you get there, don't be so quick to want to talk. Go there to listen. Let God talk to you. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifices of fools. In other words, you think you have something to offer. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're fooling yourself. And if you're acting as if there's no God, you are the epitome of a fool, which could be implied a little bit too. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. As a dream comes when there are many cares, so the speech of a fool when there are many words. When you go in God's presence, understand that there's something to be learned. Be ready to learn. Go with open hands, if you will, instead of closed hands. Go with an open heart, open mind, another way to look at it. And realize where He is and where you are ought to make it clear the attitude that you should have. It ought to be clear. When you make a vow to God, that's where we're going. He talks about the speech of a fool. If you write in your Bible, I've circled the word fool and drawn it down to the word fools there. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. We're going to talk about that for a few minutes. It's a powerful principle that Solomon is teaching us through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It hasn't happened here, but the pandemic has kept it from happening. But every place I've ever ministered, you'll get a phone call at the church, sometimes more than once a year, but not often, but at least once a year. Someone's in the hospital, and they decide that they want to have a minister come visit. They don't have a minister. They don't worship anywhere specific. They want to talk to a minister. And the chaplains there, or someone will ask for information. What religious group, they use denomination, we don't like that word, it's not appropriate for Churches of Christ, but what religious group do you want us to call? Do you have a preference? And when they mention Church of Christ, then many times I'm in the congregation that will get a call. I'll stick my Bible in the car with me and I'll head to the hospital pretty quickly. It almost always happens. I have made a promise to God that if He will help me be cured or help me to be well, I will study my Bible more. I will start attending worship more frequently. And other things. What have they just done? They've made a vow to God. They've made a promise. If you do this, I will do this. And guess what I do? I pull out my Bible and we turn and read verse 4 and 5. I want you to understand something. God is hearing what you're saying. When you make a promise, He expects you to keep it. Now, what happens usually when you get healthy, having been in that circumstance, after making a promise like that, what is the usual response? You go back to your old habit, whatever you did before, most of the time, wouldn't you say? Isn't that human nature? I'll go to worship more, I'll study more, I'll pray more, I'll promise God, promise, vow. I'll do this if you'll help me get well, help me go home, whatever it is. And I read these verses to them. I says, I want you to understand, this is something you need to do. But making a vow obligates you even more so. What does the Scripture say? He has no pleasure in a person who's made a vow to him and doesn't honor it. He's a fool. He's acting as if there's no God because you've talked to me as God and then you don't act like you see me as God, is the way to interpret the verse. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. And you can't be any clearer than that. You can't be any clearer. I'm going to speak to our Facebook audience for a moment. You all can just ignore me if you want to. Some of us are making promises to God when this pandemic lessens. I want to get back to Cedar Grove worship. I need to get back to what used to be. God's listening, and He expects us to honor those commitments. There's reasons. No one's denying that. And no one's putting guilt on any person. But there's a point to where if we make a promise to God and if we make a vow, to use the other word here, He wants us to honor that promise. And He wants us to get back to what was the habit of our life before rather than what is now the habit. And it's a good habit for safety concerns. But be careful, because God hears what we promise, and He expects us to honor it. How serious is that? Does it sound serious? Well, here's the next statement. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin. My circumstances has caused me to promise or vow something. I've made a vow to God. By the way, I don't pronounce V-O-W correctly. If Terry were here, I'd ask her when we get home, did I do better this time? My sloppy English on 3 words, I can't correct it. For years, I would say wash your hands, and she says, Gary, it doesn't have an R. I know, W-A-S-H. Well, say it. Wash. Gary, it doesn't have an R, okay? Say it for me. And I'll hear her say it, and then I'll say it, and she'll just laugh. I don't know if I'm doing better or not. I make the word vow, V-O-W, to sound like V-O-W-E-L. The English term of vowels and pronouns or whatever. I'm trying to do better. I'll have to tell her to go listen to the tape because she's in class and see if I'm making improvement. I forget the other word. I'm still working on them. My sloppy Tennessee, California, China, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, now Alabama, for some reason that word is just not very specific with me, as hard as I try. But don't let your vow or promise lead you into sin. You're saying something that it's sinful not to follow through. Say what's real. Tell the truth. Don't play games with your words. Let your intent come through when the circumstances have been changed. Why would the Pharisees and the scribes be making a vow over the altar or the temple or the gold in the temple or the item put on the altar? What are they doing? There's something specific in mind. It's a specific event. It's a specific reasoning. We see the intent because of what Jesus has told us. And we see the underlying problem. You're trying to get away with something by saying something with a little trick sentence in it. It's a little tricky thing that excuses you from doing what you've just said before God or before someone, and they're taking it as something serious. So it's something specific, and it's viewed as a sin by God if we don't keep it. And some of us may need to go back and rehearse moments in our life and repent of that if we didn't realize the seriousness of it. And do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. You go to a representative of the temple and you're telling him something you should be telling God, seems to be the inference. Don't go to the temple messenger and tell him, my vow was a mistake. I shouldn't have said that. I didn't mean it. Or I wasn't able to fulfill it. And what are each of those four things? They're excuses for something you said you would do. You staked your personhood on it. You staked your name on it. You staked your character on it, if we could say that, depending on what it is and who it is and what we're talking about. So don't go tell the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? It's telling us God is angry at the vow that you've made to Him and you're not keeping, and He will destroy the work of your hands, the fruit of your labor, the consequences of your life from that point forward, however you would seek to understand it. Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. The different translations, vanity or chasing after the wind. Much dreaming and many words are vanity or chasing after the wind are meaningless. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you say. Mean it. And let people know that's the kind of person we are. Your yes, your no has that meaning. And then the therefore statement. Boy, it's a big deal. Therefore, stand in awe of God. Where did he begin? A person who's going into worship. What happens in the place of worship? Who's there? What's your attitude? I'm going in to listen, not talk. I'm going to be a person of few words. And when I do have words, they're going to have meaning. I'm going to mean what I say. And I think he's implying that maybe you will hear something at the temple by the temple messenger, because he's brought up here. And the Hebrew word's difficult, and the translations usually has a little mark around it, a parenthesis or brackets or something. It's not a real clear phrase that's being used here, so the interpreters do the best they can with an awkward word. But it's implying that maybe someone said something that's going to encourage you to make a response. Teacher, minister, temple area, whatever. It's encouraging a response from us. And God's going to ask us to fulfill that response. He's going to hold us to our words. Do we like that idea? Is that a good thing with us? Depends on how faithful you are to your words. If you feel as if when you say something you mean it, and you're going to be as faithful to those words as possible, and we are human, we're not suggesting that, anything different than that. But if we're a person of our word and we usually try to speak the truth, and God knows that about us, then we aren't encumbered at all by what we've just been taught. But if we aren't that kind of person, if we tend to speak things that we know are just, it's just leaving us an opening to not do what we've just suggested. We didn't say it firmly. It's not clear. It's just a suggestion, and we use that to get away with it. These are harsher words. It depends on the kind of person we are and how valuable we hold our own words, coupled with action that others would see and hear. So stand in awe of God. God's there. God's listening. God expects you to honor that vow or promise. Stand in awe of God. It's a powerful, powerful summation to some words that are fairly clear to us. And certainly I think they go hand in hand with that woe that was proclaimed to the Pharisees. Societies have had various means of trying to make its people keep their word, one writer said. In some, the most sacred and binding vow was sealed with the blood of the parties involved. I never did that I remember as a child. I was not in the Scouts. When you're the second of 9 children, you have your own scout team. And we went camping and things as a family often, so I was never part of a scout. But I know that there are times when you sit on television, Mark Twain's writings and Opie on Andy Griffith. They take a knife, and what do they do with that knife? They'll cut their finger. And 2 little boys, I don't know if girls are this crazy, boys do things like this. And they'll touch their fingers to where the blood from each of their small cut mingles. And what is that suggesting? We're blood brothers. We say what we mean. You can trust me. I have your back. Whatever you suggest to it, it has that meaning. We're blood brothers. And others said, let me find my words. In others, an agreement is written in a contract, which each party signs and which often specifies penalties for defaulting. That's the grown-up way. It's a legal way. Until recent years, many Western courts of law required those giving testimony to swear to tell the truth and invoking God's help as you're swearing or promising or affirming in a court of law under the penalty of perjury. What did your mom and dad, how did they impress upon you to tell the truth? Do you remember? To watch your words, watch your language even. That's different, but I think of that more than the other. I made a decision. Mom and Dad never knew about this. I made a willful decision in the 7th grade that I was going to curse. I was going to cuss. I thought it would get me good attention, and for some reason it just seemed like a good thing to do. It makes no sense. Didn't make any sense after a week. Because people looked at me and they didn't like it and they didn't appreciate it, and I could tell that, and so I just as quickly decided I'm not going to do that ever again. I'm not going to do that. Now, Mom and Dad, before that 7th grade week, never knowing about that, what would they do when I would say a word that I should not be saying? Does this give you a hint? Wash your mouth out with soap. And Mother would make sure that my mouth was wet and the soap was big, and it didn't happen very often. Don't you think that gets your attention? Our words have meaning. And that's a different incident, but it's a way of suggesting that we need to be able to say what we mean and mean what we say. And if we say words we shouldn't, whatever is required to change those words, to change them with soap on the mouth. Some of you are smiling. Some of you apparently never had that happen. Here's your chance to tell us. How many have never had your mouth washed out with soap as a child? 4. Good for you. Most of us don't want to admit it, but my hand's high. I already have. It's on tape. It was their way of teaching us something. So our words have meaning. I want to be careful how I tell this story. I only have 3 minutes. I know of a young boy raised in a Christian home that over a period of time it became very clear that he was lying all the time. And his parents would catch him in those lies. And they would punish him, and they would try to teach him, we don't need to do that. Trying to make that point. The older he became, it seemed like it worsened. And he became even better at it, if that's a word that could describe his feeling about it. And finally, they just said, they called his name, "Why do you lie?" And he looked up as innocently as a little boy could be, and by now I think he was 12 or 13. He says, "I just believe what I say." He had lied so much that he believed it. He believed it. Now, I think that's true in politics. I think there are people that say something, and they say it long enough, people believe it instead of seeing it for what it is, a lie or a pretense. If something's repeated enough, some people will believe it, even the person who is the source of the words. That's what this young man said. He just believed his lies, and so he could tell them very easily. In his mind, it was the truth. And then he would be called on it, caught, and he'd have to admit it eventually. Well, let's be better than the Pharisees. Let's pursue righteousness. Let's be sure our words mean what we want them to mean, and it's honest before God. My dad, and then we'll close, my dad taught Terry and I, me first, her later, sometimes when talking to children, if you go to a child and say, "Tell the truth," that's not really clear to a lot of children. That's not really clear. Here's what he taught me. Get down to wherever they are, get on their level, look them, hope I can get up in a minute, look them in the eye, especially if they're younger, and say, "Tell me what really happened." Those are the words he would use. Tell me the truth. That's hard for a 7-year-old. They're not sure what the truth is. Tell me what really happened. And it was his way of teaching them how to express what was being asked of them. We need to maybe use those simpler words. We need to tell or say what really happened when we're talking about things in life. Hopefully not about people. That could be gossiping. But what really happened. Thank you. We're going to try to figure out these